the show where we discuss the biggest video game news of the week. I am Washington Post reporter Nathan Grayson, and today we're talking about Sony's recent plan to acquire Bungie and the coming, what seem to be video game industry consolidation wars. To do that, I've brought on two very good guests, both of whom have talked about and covered all of this in various capacities. Uh, we have Ethan Gach from Kotaku.com, a website that I've never heard of and hate. I don't know how I can do both of those things, but people contain legions. Say hi, Ethan.
Hello, thank you for having me.
Yeah, of course. And we are also joined by Rob Zacny of Waypoint/Vice.
And once upon a time, also of the hateful Kotaku.
That's true. Yeah.
Wow, man.
Long histories.
Yeah. And also briefly, at least in a freelance capacity, a PC gamer. You remember that moment where we
yeah.
worked together?
Well, do I remember? Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Strange times to think about in that was like 400 years ago.
Like literally, yes, it's many apartments ago, many stages of life ago, and yet also not that long ago that you and
Yeah.
I were like coordinating news stories.
I know, right? It's bizarre. But anyway, so yeah, enough reminiscing. Let's talk about the bold, unknown, and terrifying future of basically just a bunch of game companies buying each other. So, I mean, this week we saw Sony buy Bungie. Obviously, there have been a lot of acquisitions recently. The impression I get, though, is that one was, the result of 5 or 6 months of planning. But pretty clearly, a lot of companies are saying, like, yeah, it's time to start buying up other companies and kind of preparing for what is to come in the games industry. And so, I guess, like, to begin, do you guys think that this is like a kind of that this is all happening in this moment? Is this kind of a coincidence, or is this more indicative of like, yeah, you know, the future of the games industry is kind of playing out in front of our eyes right now?
You want to start, Rob?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think it's happening because there are underlying issues that are driving some of this. I think like just the history of the games industry is the bets becoming bigger and bigger to like compete in the AAA space, what we call like what's regarded as like premium or mainstream games. It requires more and more money to just as table stakes to operate in there, and the amount of risk that's assumed each time you make one of these products grows greater and greater. And so like it doesn't surprise me that over the years, like you always see sort of waves happen where people can't continue to operate in that space anymore, and they sell out and they're acquired by bigger companies, and then those bigger companies often sort of narrow the amount of projects they're approving, the amount of bets they're making, and like that's sort of the arc we're on. I think this is just it is the latest stage of this. I think what feels strange about it is that some of the names involved now are companies that we've almost regarded as immortal, right? Like that like Activision selling Microsoft. Activision was the big fish that ate the little fish. And now even Activision is sort of like looking around and saying, that's a good price. Time to sell out. Now, admittedly, those decisions are being driven by executives who have every reason to sell out. And so like I don't want to be too absolutist and say nobody can afford to stay in the space anymore. I think there's a lot of reasons that decision makers would want to make these choices. But I do think like this all fits with just the arc of the games industry we've seen since like maybe forever, certainly since the 90s into the 2000s.
Hmm.
Yeah, just to underline that point, you look at the original publishing deal for Halo on the original Xbox, and it was something like 50 or 60 million. And then you look at the publishing deal Bungie did with Activision Blizzard for Destiny, and it was, I think, in the realm of 500 million. And now they're being sold for over 3 billion. Fast Company did an article just looking at even adjusting for inflation. That's just a ridiculous increase in money, which in some ways is just indicative of to Rob's point, the cost of being in that business. And I think one of the interesting things about Bungie in particular is that they've managed to make, one of the things I think that interested Sony in them is that they're able to make a live service game in Destiny 2 that still had extremely high production values and polish and felt like a premium experience despite the fact that it's being stretched over years and years and seasonal content. and it's very unique in that way. But at the same time, it's sort of at the intersection of both of those trends of
Mhm.
companies trying to create fish bowls to keep players in, where they'll keep spending money and also deliver ever increasing AAA values for mainstream audiences.
Right. Right. And I mean, it's one of those things where, like, Bungie, especially, is very specialized in this regard in a way that I think maybe people underestimate simply because of like how much of a clockwork schedule they have it down to. But I mean, even just as a point of comparison, like, the series that put Bungie on the map in a lot of ways is Halo. And you look at now 343 trying to steward Halo forward into sort of more of a live service model, and like they're having a lot of trouble. Like it's not an easy thing to do. And so, yeah, I think that it makes sense that Sony looked at Bungie and they were like, okay, well, they know what they're doing. They have a proven track record, and if we're going to grow in this area, then this company makes a lot of sense.
I wanted to ask you both about this aspect of it though. Like, is Bungie really like Bungie's good at it by AAA studio standards in a lot of ways, but when we're talking about like live service games, um, like if you're comparing Bungie, if you move the frame of reference to games like Warframe, for instance, is Bungie really that terrific at doing this? Like I think it's an important point that they've adapted their production values and style of game to the live service model, but at the same time, like when I think Sony sort of even said they absolutely said that like one of the things that interested them about Bungie was that they could help stand up live service games
Hmm.
for Sony, and to an extent, like I think like one it was clearly a painful like growing process to get Destiny to this point and make it a like satisfying live service experience, but also if you're comparing that to probably what is like I'm curious how what Bungie has achieved with Destiny stacks up to what is kind of par for the course in free to play or
Hmm.
in God help us mobile.
Right. Well, yeah, I mean, like that's a little bit tougher, and I'm sure I want to pass this off to Ethan in a second because he's a Destiny guy, so he can speak to this on a lot of levels. Um, but yeah, I think it's sort of a mixture of things. Like you talk about, for example, Warframe, which, by the way, everyone go play Warframe. It's incredible, and people sleep on that game. Um, but I mean, yeah, like I think there are different levels and approaches to live service games. I think that also, like, it's worth noting that there's not really a standardized model here. Like every
Hmm.
game kind of does its own different thing. But it's like, okay, so in terms of options, there's almost no way that anybody's buying Epic, especially because Tencent already holds or owns quite a bit of them. So like that wasn't an option. Like Fortnite is kind of the de facto live service, constant update game, at least in terms of maintaining people's interest. I mean, maybe Digital Extremes would have sold. Now that you mention it, that would be interesting. But then also, I think that it's worth considering like the kinds of games Sony likes to have in its stable. Destiny manages to
Hmm.
walk that line of being a live service game, but also like high production value, very cinematic, like telling an overarching story. It sort of fits with the games that they already tend to like market and know what to do with. And then there's also the other part where, they seem interested in doing like some sort of TV or multimedia expansion. So I think it's a bunch of different things that aligned in that particular case. But again, Ethan, go for it.
Yeah, I think there's, it's sometimes I'm a little trigger happy in applying that whole like metaphor of will Netflix become HBO before HBO becomes Netflix. But I think there's something similar with the sort of Warframe and Destiny arcs, because clearly Destiny started as more of like a Halo game with these multiplayer live components, and then has sort of shifted into being a full seasonal live service game with, I think as Bungie has tried to move to like a more sustainable model, they've had to bring those things down. um, Forsaken was, I think, the high watermark for a lot of Destiny fans, and that was at the height of the Activision Blizzard deal, and also reporting wise, seemingly at the height of a lot of just bad working conditions at Bungie. Um, on the other hand, you see, I think, Warframe trying to up its production values and have more cinematic storytelling and sort of move more into that um, glossier realm, where they've had the seasonal live service stuff and like incremental updates and progression down for a while. And I think definitely, to Rob's point, much better than Destiny has ever done it, even this day. Like Bungie just is preparing to launch its new crafting system for its big new update, and it's like stuff that has been in Warframe forever because it's what most games have done. But the Arc of Destiny is like wanting to be a shooter that regular people would play, but with a sort of like MMO feel, to now just they fully embrace like, oh, we just want to be World of Warcraft with guns, and that's what we're doing now. And I do think that I like there was rumors at some point that Tencent or even Sony or someone else would buy Digital Extremes. Digital Extremes, I think, is like a third the size of Bungie, at least at this point.
Did that because like I actually, because somebody pointed this out in the chat, and I was just checking.
Yeah.
Digital
They're owned by a Chinese
Extremes
holding company.
that is owned by Tencent. So like I had to go to Wikipedia. I was like, their parent company is Leu, and then above Leu, you've got Tencent. So like, and that's kind of thing, right? If you're thinking about like, well, competing with Tencent, what Tencent kind of has in the stable are probably like some of the leading like free to play games across a couple different models. But I see your point though. Like, to adapt what the types of games that Sony wants to make to that like live model, it probably doesn't look a ton like existing free to play games, or at least they don't want it to. They want it to like keep that Sony prestige feel, but then also keep people coming back to the well on the regular.
Right, and that's the huge difference between those two models, is that Destiny is not free to play, even though it pretended to go free to play at one point. It still charges a premium for its
to everyone's confusion.
Yeah. But it's still like, is sort of like a golden goose in that way, that it's managed to charge $40 for its upcoming expansion, in addition to charging $15 or $10 for seasonal passes, in addition to charging Fortnite prices for in-game cosmetics. And it's managed to like kind of like cross that Rubicon and have people follow it. Whereas, I think Warframe is obviously has a different flavor, being a completely free to play experience. And there's also a part of me that doesn't know that this is a fit at all for Sony. I mean, analyst Michael Pachter was saying in a gamesindustry.biz article that he thinks, this is an act of desperation, that the price was just wildly like inflated, and that, as companies make giant moves like this, to Rob's point, it begets more giant moves because people start having to take wild swings because they need to stay bigger, and they don't want to like have some like, obviously Sony wasn't the only one who would have wanted to buy Bungie. I think, for a lot of companies, it was probably a harder thing just to get Bungie to sell versus to make them an offer that would be decent. And so, part of me is not convinced that the Sony's plan, which on paper from its investor meeting is to make 10 live service games in the next 4 years and double its first party game revenue, that's an achievable goal, or that the Bungie acquisition gets them there, that you can sort of acquire the talent needed to make that happen, when Destiny is a game that through fits and starts took a very tortured 7 to 8 years to get to this point. And so many other companies who aren't Digital Extremes or Bungie have failed in that space.
Right. That's the bonkers part, is that like, again, I think that it is worth noting that each of these games is very different and is a product of like its starting point, its midpoints, where it is now. Like, for example, even just to go back to Warframe, which is by all accounts like a huge success story here, having come from being this very small kind of, game that didn't have like a name IP attached to it or a major company, to growing into this thing that is now sustainable and has like a pretty big player base. I mean, that game is still like, God, to get into it is massively confusing from the outset. And also, like, it's made of all these parts where, like, some bits of the game feel like they are brand new and are super polished and, like, super modern. And, like, other parts feel like they are, more than a decade old. And it's just like all these different things together. And it's a matter of, like, having to constantly renovate that game, too, to bring, like, various parts up to speed with other parts of it. And so then to say, like, yeah, we're going to do this 10 times in 4 years, and like have each one of them kind of, become some measure of success, is like, it's a big ask.
This is the thing, like, I have trouble parsing to what degree is this just like the PR speak around the acquisition versus this is actually like the operational plan that they're about to execute. Because like on the one hand, I think, there's a few ways you could assess this. That you'd say like, hey, Bungie had a rough path getting it to this point by those fits and starts, but by this point, through excruciating effort, they have built up the muscles and understanding of the space and the psychology involved and the like development patterns you have to fit. They've done all that, and so we're going to reap the benefit of that. And we're going to plug that expertise into the existing Sony ecosystem. I can sort of like see how that makes sense, but one, I'm not sure like the model is just I'm not sure you have a brain trust there that is just a universal adapter to live live service games
Right.
to all these different studios and all these different models that Sony is contemplating. And I'm also like I'm kind of curious about if this is what would be satisfying. Like, is this what people at Bungie want to be working on? We're a
Hmm.
long way away from the days where they were eager to get away from like being the Halo studio. There's been a lot of turnover, but I do kind of like when I hear that, I kind of think like, is this what like people working at Bungie want to be doing, which is to be like sort of internal hired guns and consultants to build out like models for other games in the Sony stable. It's kind of an odd pitch.
Right. Well, yeah, and it's this weird thing of like, to your point, again, there seems to be a perception, at least based on kind of, the PR that Sony's putting forward, that all you need to do is take people who have experience making one of these games and they can make tons of other games like this. And like I can understand that thinking from the standpoint of somebody who's like an on high executive and maybe doesn't know all of the ins and outs of this that well. But I mean, yeah, it really seems like making a successful live service game, at least so far, is kind of like almost a case by case thing. Um, and like, yeah, it also makes sense from that perspective that, like, for example, and this was news that in part we broke, and then in part Sony kind of announced in an earnings call or in an earnings report, that like they're trying really hard to retain all this talent because like there is a chance, like you're saying, that some of these people are not going to want to do this thing, and so like through a mixture of um, equity that Bungie employees had within their company, and then also just like various quote unquote retention programs on Sony's part. Like they're paying out a whole lot of money to employees. It's going to be approximately $1.2 billion over the course of several years because they clearly are like, yeah, we need these specific individuals to stick around because they know how to do this, at least as far as we're concerned. But yeah, I mean, like, is the pitch to Bungie employees that good? I don't know. And then also, you were talking about how we're a ways out from when they split with Microsoft, but they also then just in 2019 kind of ended their publishing deal with Activision Blizzard, which could be read as a similar kind of move, at least in terms of getting back to just being on their own.
Which even
So yeah.
there seemed to require an injection of capital from NetEase.
Hmm.
So like there's been sort of a like that Bungie's sort of been circling this fate for a while in terms of being a like live service first and foremost studio. There's one other thing that going back to the Pactor quote you cited a moment ago, the price, it did seem it seemed really inflated for
Hmm.
sure. I'm kind of curious, like, does that matter as much right now? I think it feels like one of the things that is also driving mergers is that debt's really cheap right now. Like these
Hmm.
deals are probably easier to finance than they've been in ages, and are likely to be in the future. And so like they are ridiculous sums of money
Hmm.
when you put them on paper, but there's also a little bit of you know, it's a bit like how you can go into the car dealership and like have no business buying a car, but like it is so easy to finance this stuff sometimes. And so like it's a ridiculous number they paid for Bungie. But to an extent, I am not sure how much like I'm kind of curious. Like, do you think it's a number that Sony has to sweat given how easy it is to finance these things right now?
Man, a good question. I don't have an answer to it. Ethan, do you
Yeah.
have thoughts on this one?
No, I mean, yeah, I would guess that it's not. Um, Obviously, they don't have the cash on hand to throw around in the way that Microsoft did with Activision Blizzard. I would guess that the real like knock-on effect is just everyone else on the market now is looking at this and saying like, wow, if Bungie could get this price, then we should be able to get this price. And it's, I mean, you've seen just since the Activision Blizzard deal and the Zynga deal, like stock for various game companies has shot up. You know, Ubisoft's stock has been in the pit, and even it saw a jump because everyone's like, all right, well, who's going to buy this next and pay a premium? Um, and so I think it'll be probably more interesting just to see what that, you know, if it can, you know, one of my in the same vein as Rob, I have a big question about like how the equity from these deals gets distributed out to all the people who work at a studio, you know, under the assumption that you think the people who make a thing own the thing and not just the person who it says on the building owns the thing. There's a question of, you know, that there's like a big payday out there for developers in a way that there hasn't been before because the money was siphoned through boardrooms and CEO packages and stuff. So I mean, for me, it'll be interesting to see whether or not this does. If these acquisitions are just going to stop at the top of these bigger players, or if you're going to see like more mid-sized studios be able to command a premium and be, because you know in the same way, if you're an EA or if you're someone else and you don't want to get bought, then your only opportunity is to gobble up other people and get bigger.
Right.
Which is like something Ubisoft have been doing. Like Ubisoft has 20,000 employees, which even if you know someone wanted to buy them is an ungodly like amount of paperwork and bureaucracy and human people to just like try and figure out how to integrate. So
yeah, I mean, I think it also becomes a matter of like scale and demand at that point. I was actually for a piece that we're working on about all this consolidation stuff. Earlier today, I was talking to an indie developer. God, his name is very difficult. Johanneman Nordhagen, I think is how you say his name. But in any case, yeah, he's somebody who started out in AAA, went indie for a while, and is now returning to AAA. And one of the things that he was talking about is that it's become increasingly difficult to get funding for an indie game that's not going to be like at least $1 million production. It's not going to essentially be like a junior AAA game. And like that kind of indie publishers are scaling in that direction, where before they'd take on these smaller projects and build them up. Now they're like, okay, we're almost like AA publishers essentially. And so, like, as long as that keeps happening, then there become opportunities for companies that are maybe not like who we expect to be making major, huge purchases to then purchase those and then maybe get eaten. It's the whole analog of like, you know, a whale eating a fish, eating another fish. I mean, that's consolidation, you know, in a nutshell, right? But it does seem like the direction that the industry is moving, especially if you then consider like that just opportunities for smaller developers are not really there anymore in an ecosystem dominated by things like Steam, where there's, you know, hundreds of games coming out every day and everyone's trying to make a livelihood off them. And like, as long as that's your play, your odds aren't great. Like, your odds are in fact quite bad, even if you have a really good, well put together game. And at some point, you're going to need more sustainable funding and pay than just like, here's this thing that I put, you know, years of blood, sweat, and tears into. Hope it does well.
Yeah, I
But
mean
I mean,
that's
yeah,
yeah, I mean that's one of the things that, like, this is why the risks keep going up and up and up. Like, I think even over in the mobile space, like new user acquisition became a larger and larger cost of doing business. Like, just the ability to have any product that lands with anything other than a thud in the marketplace requires so much outlay at this point. And I do think when we're talking about like consolidation, this is one of the, like, you know, I think we all got into this in part because we're fans, and we like there being a cool variety of video games. I think one of the things that gets alarming is that you're going to see, and it seems like it's been moving this direction for years. I think it's going to accelerate. You're going to see like bigger and bigger companies at the top making fewer and fewer bets, and like probably a lot of somewhat interchangeable looking products as they all begin moving toward really similar live service models. And then like they're going to be taking a ton of the air out of the room just from the standpoint of like how much marketing they can do, how big and important their games are. And then there's not going to be much that's able to operate at that like mid tier. The death of the AA game is sort of a it's done. It's a narrative that is almost completed. There just aren't many of those at this point. And then like the indie games that talked about increasingly, they tend to like Annapurna gets a tremendous amount of attention. Those are not indie games by the standards that we meant the
that
term
we
like
used to
10 years
ascribe to
ago.
them.
Yeah.
Yeah, no. And then like that unto itself also begs further questions about the kinds of games that we're going to see from now on. Because yeah, you were talking about how like I think that what we're looking at, what Sony is sort of saying here, is representative to an extent of what bigger companies want now. They want live service games and things like this. And so not only does that have a cooling effect on creativity, but I think also like it consolidates the kind of game that we're playing in this really weird direction. Because on one hand, companies want more of these kinds of games because obviously they're a long play. You get people hooked into a game's ecosystem, they play it every day, or they check in every once in a while, they spend money over time, so on and so forth. That makes business sense. But a lot of these games are also like lifestyles. You can only play so many of them. Like with box products games that have like finite beginnings and ends, you can be like, all right, played this one, done with it, on to the next one. Whereas a lot of these live service games, you just can't do that. I mean, I juggle two of them, and that is hard enough. Like just regularly checking in on like Warframe and Genshin Impact is already like, I don't have time for other games if I'm doing that like on a daily basis. And so it's interesting to me to see the industry take a turn in this direction, because that feels like it, again, people only have so many hours in the day, and you can't get them hooked on an infinite number of live service games.
But I think that's an interesting contrast between the sort of recent Sony model and Microsoft model, because you hear Phil Spencer, now CEO of Microsoft Gaming, talk a lot about expanding to like a billion players and like wanting to, the thing you can do with a live service game that you can't necessarily do with other types of games is you can find a group of people who are really into your game, and then they will support it at like, you know, 100,000 monthly users or whatever, as opposed to every annual big budget release needing to sell 10 million copies or it's a failure. Whereas you look at the Sony model, and it's been very much, we have annual one or two big tentpole releases that all have a samey sort of prestige sheen to them, and big budgets, big worlds, big cinematics, voice actors. Um, and the Sony from the PS3 era that had lots of stuff coming out of PlayStation Japan, and like weirder games, smaller games on the Vita, different, like there was just a lot of weird stuff happening. I think financially it was clearly they were having, it's not necessarily made the most business sense, but you got a lot of variety and interesting experiments that you don't see with them now. And that was one of the things outgoing president of Sony Interactive. I always confuse Sony Interactive and Worldwide Studios, but whatever position Sean Layden had before he left and they restructured, went on a speaking tour over last summer and basically was saying, mildly railing as much as anyone in the games industry will like rail against something, against consolidation, and sort of the, dinging himself, Sony, other big players for not growing the pie, so to speak, of like, they're all chasing after this like sort of core audience, instead of like, there's billions of people out there who just exist. There's billions of people who play games in some capacity, like whether it's Candy Crush, Wordle, whatever. And instead of trying to find a kind of game that will engage them, it's all about sticking to these sort of strict formulas and fighting over very intensely this very specific set. And so I think there's an opportunity there where like it doesn't have to be as zero sum as it is. And I think that's where you see Phil Spencer talking about like, I don't know, and to Rob's point, I don't know how much of this is just self-serving PR spin, but talking about the play at Microsoft for Activision and Blizzard being like, we are a gaming company, we understand gaming, and so we're taking this off the table from a Facebook or a Google or a tech company that like, boo tech companies that like don't understand this or would get into it for the wrong reasons. But I think there is
from Microsoft,
right? I know, right? Microsoft, the company whose start to all of this was literally what we're describing right now.
It's a great point. It's a great point, though. I'm sorry to interrupt, but it is just so funny that like when they put on the, like they put the little like Xbox mask
Yeah.
on, and
Yeah.
it's like we're just a little hustler here. We're just
Yeah.
we're
Just
just
a little
small
guy.
little Xbox games.
Well, I
Hmm.
think you see like the Xbox brand has, I think, probably like a warmness to it now at this point that I'm sure Microsoft would love to have for like team meetings and stuff. The rest of the
Yeah.
business,
No,
people are
there's a
like, "Oh
reason
my
why
god."
they put Phil Spencer front and center all the time. Like, I mean, he definitely, because like when even when the Activision announcement was made, everyone was like, oh, maybe this will like fix Activision with all of their like harassment and studio issues and stuff like that. Maybe because of like maybe Phil will take this on his back and just like somehow magically make it all better. And so then when he was like praising Bobby Kotick's efforts, people were like surprised, and it's like, no, this, as much as the brand they've cultivated suggests otherwise, this guy's not your best bud. He's another executive, and they're always going to roll together. And like, that's just how it is. Um, but yeah, it is this very strange trick of branding that seems to have worked for them.
But so to your point, like the Genshin Impact to me, like
Mhm.
there's all these audiences. Like, yes, as someone who's really into games and like you hear like stuff about Genshin Impact, and you're like, this sounds great. I want to get into this. Same
Mhm.
with Warframe, same with Destiny. It's like, okay, I can manage like one or two of these and then like play others for a couple hours and then put them down. But I think,
Right.
there is an opportunity there. Like Genshin Impact proves that like if you hit on the right idea and a fun game and a differentiated enough experience, then like you can create 10 live services that lots of different types of people are playing and they're all from
Right.
different groups.
Right.
But there's the question to me of like Sony's never demonstrated that that's what it can do or wants to do. Whereas like even you see at Microsoft, it's people, the core gamer people kind of get angry that there's not like that the big tentpole games
Mhm.
aren't going toe to toe with like Horizon Zero Dawn or Last of Us. But like you look at Sea of Thieves and like millions and millions of people play Sea of Thieves, especially since it's come to Steam, and it's like this huge success that like people don't talk about as much because if you're not in Sea of Thieves, it's not as visible. But it I think probably engages a lot of people who wouldn't otherwise be playing any of these other games.
Yeah, that's very true. Brief aside, to Hero in chat, whose message just got, oh, I'm not sure if it was deleted or retracted. I agree with you. And it's something that we maybe can't necessarily say in our chat, but I do think you're right. Um, but anyway, um, yeah, I think this kind of circles around too to something else that was said in chat, which is basically Chase just asked, like, does that make indie releases on Game Pass? Does this make indie releases on Game Pass more preferable? Like, if you're an indie, you sign into Game Pass, basically, because like we're talking about all these big live service offerings, and like a way that you could think about it, and especially given like the emphasis that at least like Microsoft seems to be putting on subscription services, and I think also Sony. There was a Bloomberg report that Sony has a very similar service on the way. But with that in mind, like, is there kind of a version of this where live service games become the tentpole offerings, the big ones, the like, the sorts of things where, to use the Netflix comparison, they like announce and there are tons of like headlines about it, and everyone's like, this is going to be the big new show. And then in between that, you could sprinkle more indie offerings that sort of, again, keep people subscribed to services, keep that flow of new content coming. And like, that sort of carves out a niche that indies could at least occupy to some extent.
I think so. The value proposition of this stuff gets really interesting to me because to me, just like intuitively, what makes a subscription offering maybe make the most sense isn't really the live service game. It's the sort of thing that I would be like, I want to have a fun game to play this weekend, right?
Mhm.
This is the odd thing. That doesn't seem to be how it's playing out because this is how Microsoft has built Game Pass to work, where um, I'm really curious how many people end up buying Forza Horizon 5 versus versus just playing it through Game Pass, right? I
Mhm.
don't know, but that's the strategy they've adopted. But they still have this library of stuff that like is more of a traditional like linear, long weekend or spend a week with a game model.
Mhm.
And that makes a bit more sense because I think that logic of live service games are a tremendous time commitment. It
Mhm.
doesn't take long before uh, the subscription fee, if the game is accessible elsewhere, stops making a ton of sense. And Game Pass begins to look a little bit weird if it's a giant warehouse of live service games that you
Mhm.
just pay into, and you can be like, which of these which of these neglected live service experiences can I dip into?
Mhm.
Maybe I'll see what's happening in Sea of Thieves for the first time in 2 years. I don't think that like I don't think it makes a ton of sense, but it does seem to be the way they're building it out. And I guess the idea being you're playing on the psychology of it, which is the subscription fee isn't that much. And
Right.
in the meantime, my favorite games that have these huge player bases, that have a ton of my Xbox friends playing them, they're all there. So I'm going to set this thing to auto renew, and I'm
Mhm.
going to dip in and out, and never think about it again. And you get more money out of those people. That seems to be the approach. Even though I think one of the things that makes Game Pass so exciting is that you see those monthly lists of like, here's what's coming on, or
Right, right. Like,
here's
oh
what you should
man, new
play before it
stuff.
leaves. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, Phil Spencer will differentiate between like Game Pass and Netflix by being like, on Game Pass you can still go buy the thing. We have a conventional store. You're not locked in the same way you are on other streaming services. So it's like sort of a hybrid. But like I just look at other streaming services and you see how a Netflix started or a Hulu started or even a Spotify started, and you see where they are now after they hit certain benchmarks with subscription numbers and market cap and everything. And it's like, in many the offerings just aren't as good. Spotify is a sort of a weird exception, but basically for like the deep catalog, it's like at some point you're just better off going somewhere else. Like if you Netflix, um, while there's obviously lots of people who, I'm sure there's a long tail for like, the biggest hit on Netflix on a given week versus what the random stuff majority of people will dip in and out of. I just have a hard time seeing how 10 years from now, um, there's a Game Pass that is trying as hard to cultivate so much diversity and offer deals to so many different developers, just because it could, because cloud servers print money for Microsoft, and it's not, the economics of these companies don't necessarily make sense in the way that like some other conventional input output companies do. But like, um, I just don't see how over the long term. Obviously, Game Pass is going to get more expensive, and if they have Bethesda's games and Blizzard's games and Call of Duty all on Game Pass, then why are they also shelling out $500,000 to get the latest Drinkbox indie game on there that maybe 20,000 people play?
Mhm.
I mean, I think some of it is like I think you're absolutely right that we are still in a sweetening the deal phase of all this, where
Mhm.
like the way Game Pass looks now and the way it has looked since launch is probably not what the end game of Game
Oh no.
Pass would look
No,
like,
they
right?
they are going to increase that subscription price as
Yeah.
soon as it makes sense to do it.
Right, like I don't know, like we all have different thresholds, but like Netflix did not take long before they hit my threshold
Mhm.
of like, haha, look at the bounty I'm getting for this small fee, to like, oh, I hate you guys. I hope I hope you can take your
Mhm.
4K and shove it. Um, and I think like Game Pass is going to move in that model, but for the meantime, it's going to be this continue even if you are only playing a couple of those games a month, the
Mhm.
value proposition of all these things is that look at all the selection and variety you get. By the way, we all know you're just going to play the same game or watch the same thing again
Mhm.
and again. But yeah, I don't know what the future of this looks like as far as Xbox's interest in maintaining this like slate of content. And the other thing is, and I think this is where like the Xbox thing in particular maybe becomes of interest to like regulation, is
Mhm.
that if you look at if you look at Game Pass deals as being a thing where Microsoft has a tremendous amount of power as the buyer
Mhm.
for the licenses here. There's a version of there's like a like buyer side version of Monopoly called Monopsony, where like if you are the only if you are the market for a variety of products, and people basically have to sell to you, or there's no one else to sell to meaningfully,
Mhm.
um, that also distorts the market massively. And I
Mhm.
think as you start seeing like Game Pass becoming more and more of a compelling offer, and it also like offers a chance for games to get noticed just by virtue of having like, front and center billing on Game Pass. I do wonder if that also starts becoming part of the conversation where game developers start looking a bit like commodity manufacturers
Mhm.
who are selling to Microsoft effectively for this library, because that's ultimately, you can chance it on Steam. You can hope that your marketing department, gets the message out that
Mhm.
you made a cool thing. But Microsoft is always there being like, here's the going rate to become a Game Pass game and
Right.
like stand out from the crowd.
Yeah, well, this is also like, so there are a couple things here. One of them is that, like, yeah, this is already why, for example, for a while, like, everyone, all the indies were like, oh man, if you get your game on Switch, like, that's a way better, you're just going to do better than you do on Steam. And that's also why a lot of indie developers cut deals with Apple for Apple Arcade, because it was just, much more guaranteed success. But then beyond that, what you're talking about here, I talked to somebody with the let's see, American Economic Liberties Project earlier today. And he was saying that, like, yeah, basically, these are the sorts of things that the FTC is going to look at when they are examining the Microsoft deal specifically, because, like, it could be viewed as an attempt to shift the entire landscape. And if they are shifting the landscape in such a way as they, can be the only victor, then that is, a monopolistic practice that is, worthy of antitrust scrutiny. And it's kind of an interesting situation right now because, like, we don't really know how the FTC is going to handle this on the same day that, coincidentally, on the same day that Microsoft announced its intention to buy Activision Blizzard, the FTC and the DOJ both basically said, like, yeah, we're going to be harsher on mergers and acquisitions. But we haven't really seen that play out yet. So, Microsoft Activision could be kind of a test case for it. But it remains to be seen exactly how that'll play out. And it'll be a matter of a bunch of different things. One of them being, and this was a really interesting thing that I learned today. One of them being just it's a simple matter of resources. So when kind of this element of the FTC was envisioned, it was like the 1970s. And the basic idea is that they predicted, oh, there'd be like 150 major mergers per year. And so the person I talked to today was like, there are that many major mergers every 2 weeks now. And yet the scale at which the organization operates is still more in line with that 1970s envisioning. And, like, also, it has been defunded over the years in various ways, all of which means that it has to, kind of pick and choose where it's going to apply the greatest pressure and scrutiny. And even then, stopping a merger is, a legal process. It involves going to court, and it involves litigation, it involves all of these different things. And so, like, there are many valid reasons for there to be scrutiny here, but the question is, will it actually be applied? Will this particular iteration of the FTC apply it? And, like, if so, how will that play out? And it's really hard to say. And that also shows in, like, the ways that even, like, the stock market is reacting to this. Another thing this person pointed out is that, like, Activision Blizzard stock prices are still, like, it seems like people are holding off on being like, yes, this is definitely happening. And it reflects in the stock price. People are like, we'll wait and see.
Yeah, I mean, this is sort of the regulatory environment we live in, right? Where just across the board, because they're under resourced and underfunded, and like major companies can just like send like literal armies of lawyers out to fight these battles. There is an element of like major corporations can basically Naruto run past the regulators because
Mm-hmm.
they can't process it all.
Uh-huh.
So that's a definite component of this as well. I tend to suspect that like if just because of the timing, this one might end up getting some scrutiny just because it's such a interesting test case and it doesn't touch on the same massive entrenched interests on the scale that like agriculture policy
Right, right.
does, which like the Biden administration sort of notably has kind of been mum on. because they appointed some very like big ag friendly people to positions of power. So like it's not being equally applied. Do you
Mhm.
think it's alarming though that like none of us think the Sony acquisition has any like
Oh yeah.
nothing to worry about in terms of regulation for Sony,
Hmm.
because like ultimately what they're doing here is they're augmenting an existing business model and trying to stand up a line of business in live service games, but like it still feels like they're a long ways away from anything that's going to be mentioned in the same breath as like Game Pass as like a credible competitor.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it is very much this thing of like, so the impression I get obviously is that Microsoft and Activision Blizzard are the big target. But at the very least, like to an entity like the FTC, Sony Bungie, Take-Two Zynga, all of that is still going to be like context that they will consider. Like anything that looks like consolidation definitely stands out for an entity like the FTC. And so I mean, like, will that work out for Sony? Probably. It'll probably be fine, but it's also not nothing in the eyes of the FTC. Like they are, I think especially in the case of something like Microsoft and Activision Blizzard, they're looking at that. That does factor.
I think it's the video game space is such a weird one for these types of questions because like most people, a lot of people covering antitrust now are coming from a tech background because the focus of it has been so much recently on Facebook and Amazon. And I think, and it's weird because you look at like Microsoft gaming and there's both a hardware component and a platform, like a social community component. So there's the users who, of the total gaming users out there, Microsoft has its share. But then it also has share of the console market, which is relevant only because you can't, like, people can't put their games on the Xbox without going through Microsoft. Like there's this sort of baked into the gaming model is this sort of original anti-competitive practice of having a piece of hardware and locking it and then saying, like what Epic is trying to ding Apple for right now with the 30% commission is just like normal video game business. Um, so it's almost like becomes weird. Like, what does it mean to say that um, Microsoft having too many IPs? Because like, what is like an Activision Blizzard is a collection of studios who make games, and so is the anti-competitiveness, is the concern on the labor side that they control so much of the production in this industry that it creates an unfair advantage? Is the concern about Game Pass and how many potential users it would have, such that that would become this sort of whale in the marketplace that everyone has to contend with? Like, it's just, I think it. I hope there's obviously lots of scrutiny, and if for no other reason than to like start creating frameworks for thinking about these questions in a way that I don't think obviously the regulators have not had to before.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean that's another thing too is that the companies that have been bought very recently all kind of come with like built-in pretty large user bases. Like, so you're not just buying IP or even like talent and capability. Like, user base is a major thing that I think a lot of people don't really think about in the same way in quite its firm of like monetary terms. But I mean, I think that that's, a major appeal. And going back to like, why would Sony get Bungie? And it's like, well, because Bungie's managed to command and maintain a massive user base for a long time. One that will, like, if they hear a Bungie game, they're probably going to go check out that game, which vastly improves its chances of success. And then if you have like, 10 service games that Bungie has touched, um, you have a much better chance of those games taking off or at least like having an initial good start. And in video games these days, honestly, like that's kind of everything. Like if you have a good start, then your game has a lot of momentum and can keep going for a while. But if not, then uh, you know, good luck. Mhm.
Yeah, I'm like I think it's a good question though in terms of it is an odd space to apply some of these questions because, and I think this is maybe the thing working in Microsoft's favor in terms of like having this thing slip past regulators is there's a lot of ways you could look at this, and in none of them is it clear cut like what is the abuse we're looking to prevent here.
Mhm.
Um, and yet there's causes for alarm from multiple angles. And I think that's going to be that's going to be some of what gets hashed out here. But I do feel like one of the things that's going to be really salient when it comes to Microsoft is the fact that, especially as things move toward a more like streaming video games model rather than selling the box,
Mhm.
and you have like a subscription like model baked into that. The question becomes like, is micro like I think like one of the salient questions is going to be, is Microsoft becoming such a strong incumbent in the space with so many like predatory pricing options open to them that it becomes anti-competitive? Because ultimately, like we're saying, Game Pass is a loss leader, which I think
Oh,
Microsoft
yes.
has said outright it is.
Hmm.
There's always like one person's loss leader is another person's predatory pricing
Yeah.
strategy, and like that hasn't been enforced in ages, right? Like this was the famous like Uber thing of like, how did Uber destroy taxis? Well,
Hmm.
they just started like covering the fares like under the table, so that customers were getting cheaper rides, from Uber than they were taxis. But like we haven't seen that sort of stuff enforced vigorously in ages. But it doesn't take like it doesn't take much imagining to see like how, looking at it from this other angle of, are you making it impossible for people to compete in the space who don't have access to massive capital reserves?
Hmm.
I think that's where it starts to get a little bit touchy for Microsoft, and that's before you get into just how much stuff they can now control within the Game Pass ecosystem just by virtue of these acquisitions.
Yeah. Well, and
Um,
I mean, I think the other thing here to keep in mind is time frame. So you're talking about, the rise of Uber and like kind of these what turned out to be like loss leading anti-competitive practices. And like the time during which that unfolded and the time that even I think a lot of people realized that's what they were doing or that's what they did kind of like overlap with the Trump administration, during which I think the sort of FTC and DOJ looked at these things and said, like, well, no, this is good. So like this is all okay. But now that we have kind of like the result of those learnings of understanding like this is a tactic, and then also an administration more willing to be aggressive in its approach to acquisitions and mergers, I think that we do have kind of fertile soil for, one of these bodies kind of calling out a company like Microsoft on it, being like, it's pretty clear this is what you're doing. And like, we are not necessarily going to stand for that. I mean, again, it all at this point is speculative. There's not really a good way to know yet because there haven't been any applications of this. But like, you could kind of hope, given how well understood this tactic is at this point, that, that would be a pretty major factor that something like the FTC would consider here.
yeah, like, and crucially, like, I think it was a bipartisan failure to enforce these things. Like I think
Right, of course.
famously, the Obama administration was also really friendly and deferential to tech.
Hmm.
Like I think their probably biggest missed opportunity is the Instagram acquisition that I think happened on their watch,
Hmm.
under with Facebook, where it was pretty clearly an anti-competitive merger, but the Obama administration wasn't really in the business of caring about that stuff. So
Right.
they kind of watched the ball sail into the goal.
Hmm.
And I do think like now we like I think the thing that has changed is we've had a decade of watching these policies in effect,
Yep.
and there are a lot of influential stakeholders in a variety of sectors who are like, "Hey, this has gotten really tough for us now to exist in these spaces." And I don't think, and I'm not saying everyone sort of like got leftist on this issue. I think the thing to remember is when we're talking about like bigger and bigger fish, that also means there's a lot of smaller fish that are very worried. And those
Hmm.
smaller fish like are still people we consider enormously wealthy and influential and still have the ears of like politicians. But like there are more people like that also who are starting to look to the refs for some help, because 15
Hmm.
years ago they were at the scale where the refs being this permissive was helpful to them. Now in 2022, suddenly it's like, whoa, hold on. The weight
Yeah,
classes here are all screwed up.
yeah. Right, right. Now suddenly they are being beaten by, yeah. Um yeah, I mean, it's also interesting to consider. And in fairness, like the impression I get is this won't have a tremendous impact in maybe the way that the FTC would do things. But I mean, like So if we're talking about both Microsoft and Activision Blizzard, they both are, at least like in terms of hires, somewhat political players. Microsoft currently employs a former FTC commissioner, which is intriguing.
Well, and the head of DOJ antitrust is an ex-Microsoft lawyer.
Right.
But
And
he's also one of the hawkish dudes, which I also find really interesting. Jonathan Cantor was a Microsoft lawyer, and went over the DOJ and is like, we got to do something about these mergers.
right. Yeah, but I mean, what better way to, defang efforts like that than to just bring the person on, give them a lot of money. But yeah, and then like similarly, Activision Blizzard has hired, people from both the Bush and Trump administrations. And again, the impression I get is that like with the FTC, this doesn't give them that much pull, but in Congress, helpful. So, there are all these little ways too that when companies become this big and this powerful, they also acquire more power through like social engineering and through just recognizing like, here are some people who might help our cause just by having them around. But I mean, again, they like, it's not a fun thesis or really even a very interesting one, but it's like this, the long and short of it all is this is very complicated. Like, there are so many different intertwining factors that will decide what happens from here on out, just in terms of like, will Microsoft actually get to acquire Activision Blizzard? Will it not? Will it be tied up in court for a lot of years? Will it not even have that happen? Like,
I
you
also
know,
I also think it's also not inevitable. Like there's a feeling of consolidation and the pace of mergers right now, acquisitions that makes it feel like we're steamrolling towards a very specific future. But you see yesterday, Facebook stock dropped what 20% because
yeah.
investors are skittish on falling user numbers and ad revenue because of Apple's new privacy measures and Mark Zuckerberg spending 10 billion on VR. And there's like you can understand almost in a sense the urgency of his pivot to the so-called metaverse, because there's a future in 10 years from now where nobody gets on Facebook and nobody cares.
Mm-hmm.
And I think similarly there's a future in which this Activision Blizzard deal, which came together, I think, a lot more, based on some of the Wall Street Journal and Bloomberg's reporting, and based on your reporting of Bungie, that it came together in a much more slapdash way and like an opportunistic way. And there was this Herman Holst, head of Worldwide Studios at Sony, had what I considered a zinger at Microsoft when he was being interviewed by GQ, I think, after they acquired Housemarque or someone else. But basically being like, we do very targeted acquisitions. It's a studio we've worked with before. There's a meeting of the minds. The cultures overlap. We have the same values, etc. And kind of, but in a very, this was obviously while Microsoft is just gobbling up Bethesda and everyone else, and seemingly just in like not necessarily desperate plays, but like, oh, we don't have these same games that people want in the same way, but we can just buy them. Like, we haven't figured out how to make them, so just buy the people who are already making them. So when you look at like the Activision Blizzard, which is a huge uh, acquisition, and Call of Duty is obviously a huge moneymaker still, I think you also have to look at like, um, you know, the way Blizzard has been hollowed out in recent years, um, and the way that like the Activision model for publishing an annual Call of Duty, I think, is at the breaking point. Like, everyone keeps waiting for it to break and it doesn't, but I feel like it's at the breaking point in a way that I don't think people give it enough credit for. And I think there's a future 5 years from now where like what Activision Blizzard is at its height in the pandemic, when it was like trading at $95 a share or whatever. And that was the peak. That was the best it was ever going to do. And really what Microsoft has gotten is a bunch of big IPs, but like not the force that was behind them, that was creating these massive juggernauts. So there's a chance that they don't create new juggernauts in the future. They just have like Warzone and Overwatch 2 if it ever comes out, which is a long way of saying that like I just think there are a lot more variables with game development, especially when it comes to creating these products, that even though the risk goes down for the individuals once they get in with a big company, there's a way that risk is still subsumed by the bigger company, and it doesn't mean that these deals automatically will pan out.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, like, and I think that again goes back to also the question of like, whatever form all of this takes, like, will people actually like it? because you drew the comparison to like Meta and investments in virtual reality and all this stuff, and there's just like not evidence yet on that front that people will even like that at a scale to make it viable in a way that will actually make the companies involve money and transform the internet or whatever. Similarly, like we were talking earlier about the idea of like 10 live service games and then like subscription services that are platforms functionally like Game Pass as well. And it's like, yeah, will that actually on a moment to moment, day to day, individual to individual level work? Will people buy into that, or will they be like, this is all too complicated, or I only want to play one or two of these games, or like I'm kind of tired of this kind of game, I don't want to play Warzone anymore, Warzone's not very good? Like they're all those questions too. And yeah, I think the point you're making is really good, that even though right now there are all these acquisitions happening and there's all this momentum behind the subject, none of it's guaranteed. It can feel guaranteed because big companies doing things can make anything feel guaranteed. But yeah, again, going back to Facebook, they kind of face planted. So, nothing even at that scale is like for sure. It's just, but at the same time, again, going back to massive companies, they do have undue power to will things into existence. Just because Facebook had one bad day doesn't mean they're not going to make the thing happen in the end.
Well, and they can sustain mediocrity for a long time
Mm-hmm.
just by virtue of the fact that like there's just not very much on offer, right? Like I think the reason people go to Facebook is because there's only one Facebook, right? Now that like their growth is flat and people are probably drifting away from it, but like it's not like you can go to the Facebook like thing and like reach the same people or have the same conversation, and so you're able to sort of shamble on with the same sort of like declining service and quality and business model. And that could be where a lot of these deals end up going, is that they end up buying enormous libraries and warehouses full of like IPs and content, but ultimately the decision making is still every bit as like bloodless and tight-fisted as like Bobby Kotick's was helming Activision. And ultimately, like I think sort of the worst case scenario is that we move toward a future where games are at once extremely boring and yet so cheaply bundled and convenient that even though like people are having less fun and like people are less engaged or attached to the games they play, it ends up just being able to succeed just by virtue of the fact that like through sheer marketing budget, through the cheapness of a subscription service, through the sheer ubiquity of these things, people tune in to play the latest Microsoft-led Call of Duty, or the latest Microsoft-led Blizzard game, regardless of whether it's particularly good. Just because that scale, it also can't really completely fail. That's kind of the grimmest thing that I see as a possibility, which is like games consolidation leads us to a really flat. And I think that's how a lot of us have described the types of big AAA games that get made right now, right?
I was
Very
about to say,
flat. Yeah.
yeah, this kind of seems to be like the dying light discourse. Like, I mean,
Yeah.
it's the big game of the moment, but everyone's been kind of like, at best, it's pretty all right, but like, it's
But there's a
not,
lot of it.
yeah, there's a lot of it.
do you
Yeah,
want do you want like several weeks worth of your life to be just all right? It's kind of good.
yeah,
And like I sometimes wonder if that value proposition will ever stop working. I've sort of been there being like, justice has to come for Far Cry at some point. Eventually, people are going to realize it's the same game.
yep,
Hasn't
every single
happened
time.
yet. And I think in our bubble, we tend to underrate these things because we play a bunch of games and we do realize, oh God, I can't do this anymore. I've like played this game. I've played this game for 10 years. It hasn't meaningfully changed or improved. I'm out. And the thing we don't see is that like there's that fan base that loves it for those same reasons. I dip in, play a few hours of those games. But that's my fear, is that like ultimately the industry caters overwhelmingly to that model of like sort of distracted, dip in, dip out, live service game. Not you can be here for an event. Doesn't really matter if you're not. You may not see the same stuff. You can play a little or a lot. Doesn't really affect your quality of life. I could see that being where things are gonna move to, especially under the Microsoft model. The thing I just keep coming back to is, where does Sony live in that world? Like, they're saying they want to stand up a bunch of live service games, but then they also want to retain sort of their prestige identity.
Right. They want to continue being seen as like the company that shepherds forward things like The Last of Us, where it's like, this cinematic experience with all sorts of, twists and turns, and that is the product of horrible labor practices. um, but yeah,
Yeah, I
no,
mean,
it's a really good question. I mean, I think again, like in an ideal world to them, they'd probably land somewhere in the middle where they'd have that appeal while also having more live service elements. But it's like all of this on paper stuff, right? And it's like, again, going back to the question of like, will people like this? It's like, is there a way to make that game where people like it? I mean, I guess maybe the closest point of comparison you could possibly draw is something like Genshin Impact, where like I mean, you can mostly just play it as a single player game. Like it has lots of narrative and, the occasional big, like lavish cutscene, that sort of a thing. But it's also like a service that you keep coming back to. But I mean, I don't know if like your standard PlayStation user would love that so much because that game is still really servicey. It's still like do your daily quests all the time. It's still like it takes a lot of grinding to get to the point where you can see a lot of story content. And so like even within that, there are very large degrees of separation that when removed from being on paper and when viewed in reality are bigger than they might otherwise seem. So I mean, we'll see. But yeah, it's a weird.
We'll see. My favorite kicker. We'll see.
I know, right?
Time
We'll
will
see.
tell.
I think yeah. I think that actually every article that any of us write should just end with either "we'll see" or "time will tell." So the only two kickers we can use from now on. um, but yeah, with that in mind, do either of you have any closing thoughts beyond "we'll see" or "time will tell"?
I got. If you've got a closing thought, you go first, Rob.
no, I think for me the most interesting thing I'm curious, and we'll know based on probably what happens over these next couple of years, is whether or not Sony emphasizes building out the content like production pipeline to really aggressively make themselves like even more than they are right now, a maker of video games, and just through sheer like wholly owned and operated library, sort of remain in the game via that, or whether we just start seeing them lift wholesale some of the model we see over at Microsoft, which is, you know, create better branding and a more aggressive wrapper on a like subscription offering, and then possibly, and I don't know how they would get here, because I'm not sure they have like the uh like server infrastructure that Microsoft enjoys, but do they start trying to figure out like how they can compete at streaming current gen games like high quality, and make that part of the offering as well?
Mhm.
Because I think right now they kind of, I'm not sure they can do both. I'm not sure they can compete as sort of the ever expanding value platform that Microsoft is offering, and at the same time pick up a bunch of like valuable IPs and publishers and developers that like rival what Microsoft has acquired in the last 2 years. I
Mhm.
think like I feel like Sony probably has to emphasize one strategy at the expense of the other. I'm really curious which way it's gonna go, because both have major upside and downside risk, and I think both kind of struggle to compete with just the sheer number of weapons that Microsoft enjoys right now.
Mhm.
I
Ethan.
don't. Yeah, I don't. I have not. I have more questions than closing thoughts. I guess one thing I'll go back to that is that I think there's also a weird. It's just bizarre to me that consoles exist. Like with the PS4 and Xbox One were both sort of admissions, more so by Sony, that like we just need to make a good, very efficient piece of PC gaming hardware.
Mhm.
And that's even more so like this is still full credit to Mark Cerny and the rest of the engineers and designers and architects over at Sony for creating what I'm not um, don't have the expertise to review, but I'm sure is like a very elegant, efficient piece of hardware that is not just a PC rig that you put together from off the shelf parts, but it's between how modular, I don't know, it just PC gaming feels like it should be the type of thing that, you know, there's a future for 10 years from now where if you want to get the $500 box that doesn't do Windows but just plays games mostly from Steam, or like the Steam tried to do PCs like that and it was a huge failure, but like in theory I don't know why it is the case that you just don't have generic set top boxes that you just play, you know, that run an operating system and you play the games on them, and maybe it's Nintendo's operating system or it's Sony's or Microsoft's, but you know, because Microsoft has already shown that it doesn't care about really selling Xboxes anymore because it's happy to stream the content to you. Um, but so I don't know. I think that there's two technological questions out there. One being the hardware question of like, is it going to be forever that um, you create whether you're Apple or Sony or Microsoft, you create a box and then you get to lock it down and dictate the terms and the rules of who gets their games on there, because then that does create lots of anti-competitive questions that like DVD players don't have or Blu-ray players don't have. God, I'm old now, aren't I? And the other thing is like, I don't know, can Unreal Engine and other technical tools bring down the cost of like mid-tier games where like you know, playing a lot of the PS5 games, like they look good, but I don't I there's this weird contradiction to me where games have never been more expensive and the costs are doubling like every 5 to 10 years, but the payoffs don't seem to be there for like the
Mhm.
average user. And so I wonder if there's not sort of overhauling coming where companies are going to start ditching their own proprietary tools and be using Unity or Unreal Engine and find ways to streamline stuff so that like you can make a Genshin Impact, which has this huge reach and by all accounts looks great and feels great, but didn't cost, you know, the 300 million that Ubisoft is going to pour into its next giant open world game.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that's a good question. And yeah, it's interesting. I just wanted to, before we part, just I think touch on like a factor and, you know, sort of the continued existence of like consoles as they are now. I think that there is, and I think this is true for maybe a lot of the subjects that we talked about today. There's something to be said for inertia, for the fact that like this is the way things have been, so they will keep being that way even long past the point where they make sense. And I think that, yeah, with things like consoles, you're seeing that. But also, when that tends to happen, there also tends to be erosion. Like, I mean, when you're talking about consoles themselves, it's like, well, also GameStop still exists, but like only barely. So, I mean, I think it's one of those things where like that's probably the future we're looking at, right? Where as a thing makes less and less sense, at least from a business standpoint, it will start to exist less and less. Um, but who knows? You know, there are companies with lots of money, so they can do whatever they want to. What a great time to be alive. Anyway, it was great having both of you. Thank you for coming through and having a really good discussion that I think people liked a lot. Um, we'll obviously be happy to have you on again in the future. This is Ethan's second time, so he's, you know, yeah, starting to get up there in the number of times he's appeared on the show.
Yeah,
Was a
no, this is
blast.
great.
Thanks
I
for
learned a
having me.
lot.
Yep.
Heck yeah. All right. Well, I'm going to, y'all can hang up now. I'd boot you, but it just seems unceremonious and mean. um, all right. So everyone don't go anywhere. I should have made this clearer sooner. But the show basically contains a second bonus segment where the idea is that we just run through some of the other news of the week a little bit more quickly, less discussion oriented. Though I love to have conversations with chat. So, you know, please fire away with your thoughts and everything on the stories that I'm about to run through, which are, you know, I think a little bit maybe less significant, but nonetheless still big ones. So, in other acquisitions news this week, slightly a smaller one, but nonetheless, Wordle, the word game that has taken the country and maybe world by storm, got picked up by the New York Times, um, which, you know, I think maybe people were pretty surprised by that one, but it kind of makes sense in that the person who was making the game was just one guy. And I think that when you're one person running something like this, eventually you're like, man, I just want to tag out. So yeah, he, I guess, commanded a low 7-figure amount, which basically means like somewhere in the millions for the game. And what this means going forward is a couple things, probably. So basically, Wordle was one of those things, right, where like came out of nowhere and was largely just people liked it. And it didn't like have microtransactions. It wasn't covered in ads. It was very much this atypical thing for the modern internet where like so much of what we end up consuming on the modern internet, and I think this actually wraps back around to the conversation we just had about live service games and everything. So much of it is tied into and envisioned with a business model in mind. Like that's, you know, where a lot of these things start. To wit, what Sony's saying about Bungie is like, we're going to pump out 10 live service games. What are they going to be? But they're going to be live service. Whereas Wordle was just like an idea to make something fun and cool. And then it got out there and people liked it. But the question becomes, you know, after something like the New York Times buys it, does it stay that way? And the answer, like, honestly, is probably no, because they did spend over $1 million on it. And their phrasing was awfully sus. They specifically said the game will initially remain free to new and existing players. And initially is doing so much work in that sentence. Um, I mean, you know, you don't put that word there unless you mean eventually it's going to stop being that way. Um, so that is sort of like the state of things, and it's kind of dispiriting in my opinion, because you end up in this place of like, even this nice thing that came out and, you know, captivated people for a minute, and that felt like finally this remnant of the old internet where people just made stuff and put it online and were like, hey, come check this out, it's a cool thing I made. Even that could only exist in that state for, you know, month and a half before it got subsumed into the kind of mega corporate online present and future. um and like, yeah, I think it's just kind of a sign of the times type of thing. Haha, sign of the times, because it's the New York Times. That is a very accidental joke that I will not take back. Yeah, it'll be walled off and it will kill the social aspect of a simple thing. Yeah, I agree with what Veranier just said in chat. Like that's the other problem that always arises from things like this, is as soon as you start walling it off, you make for an environment in which fewer and fewer people can experience it. And as a result, like the buzz around it, the conversation around it, the social element of it dies. And I mean, to really tie it back to things in a way that I think is salient, especially in this case, specifically the New York Times bought it in an era where so much of, and like WaPo is guilty of this too, so much of like the good information we receive, the news, and I don't mean good in the sense of like positive, I mean good in the sense of like well sourced, well examined and researched and understood information we can receive is behind paywalls. And like that has already, you know, clearly had an impact on society's collective ability to know what's actually happening versus being misled by people who have, you know, obviously like agendas that go beyond just simply conveying the news. And to be clear, I think that also all people who convey the news have agendas. I think nobody is free of an agenda. That's just, you know, being a human. But still, like, so now we see a news organization doing a similar thing to a little social game. And I think that you probably in the longer term have basically the same series of consequences play out over time, where it becomes harder and harder for people to access, and therefore it just drops out of people's kind of common experience and vernacular. And that's a bummer. Less of a bummer, at least if we're talking consolidation, is the fact that apparently Nintendo doesn't want to get in on the consolidation fest. We'll see if they hold to this, because, you know, as businesses change, so do companies. I remember when Nintendo was like, we're never going to go online, we're never going to like do all of these things that are now hallmarks of video games, excuse me, including the games that Nintendo now makes. But yeah, right now what they're saying about their kind of reaction to the acquisition extravaganza is that that is not their plan for the time being. Specifically, Nintendo's president said our brand was built upon products crafted with dedication by our employees, and having a large number of people who don't possess Nintendo DNA in our group would not be a plus. Which, I mean, makes sense. given Nintendo's kind of history of being very curatorial about everything they release. Like, it's really interesting to me. And I think like Sony has kind of tried to wrap around back to doing this in terms of the way that they present themselves. But Nintendo has always managed to kind of hold on to its like seal of quality reputation, right? Where like if a first party Nintendo game comes out, there's an expectation that it will be kind of a cut above, right? That in terms of like sheer quality, sheer polish, it will just be like a really well built and crafted experience. And I think there's something to the idea that if you rope in a whole bunch of studios, at least if you don't do it with like, again, care and like attentiveness to studio culture and like their approach to game making, that you will dilute that kind of invariably. Um, so like, I mean, I think that the philosophy here underlying what Nintendo's president said, like, yeah, I think that he's probably right. Um, but there's always that question of like, can Nintendo continue to go its own way amidst another sea change? And like so far, that approach again has worked out for Nintendo. Like over the years, they have kept finding ways to kind of circumvent what everybody else is doing in favor of like themselves. And to their credit, like look at the sales of the Switch. It is massively far and away one of the best-selling consoles out there. It's one of Nintendo's best-selling ever. And also, like again, during the conversation earlier, we were like, "Why are there still consoles?" Nintendo makes a good case for them. Like Nintendo's console has usage outside of simply being a box that you put in your living room. So, you know, I think that Nintendo can continue doing this for a while. The question becomes like, and this would be again very difficult, but stranger things have happened recently. Does somebody try to buy Nintendo? And I guess we'll see. Because again, so many companies that felt untouchable for the longest time in terms of being purchased or not being purchased have suddenly gotten bought. So I guess nobody's safe anymore in that regard. Let's see. What are some of the other stories of the week? I feel like this week we kind of drew a more traditionally gaming centric crowd. So I kind of want to touch on video gamey stories first. I have a bunch of like influencer, Twitch, YouTube stuff too, but I'm not sure how much that is y'all's kind of thing. Feel free to sound off in one direction or the other. But in the meantime, I'm just going to touch on some of the more like some of the news that is more about video games themselves. So let's see. Another thing that just we had our first, I guess, big delay of the year. I guess I'd call it that. I mean, maybe somebody else will say like, "Oh no, this game got delayed," and it meant a lot to me. But yeah, the Suicide Squad game has been delayed all the way into 2023, which is interesting because that game has been shown a couple times now. Most recently at the Game Awards at the end of last year, and like what they showed of it looked pretty like far along. Granted, there are a million ways that developers can do that with a game that's not as far along as you would expect, because like any sort of trailer or demo that you get for a game is like it's a specific slice of a game that's highly polished, basically up to the standard you'd expect from a completed game, but the rest of the game might be in various other states. In any case, yeah, so it's not coming out until 2023, which, um, I'm sure that's disappointing to some folks. It's actually pretty disappointing to me in that, like, I don't know. I mean, as much as I'm very over superhero stuff, this game looks cool. And like what? It's Rocksteady, isn't it? And Rocksteady, yeah, Rocksteady made the Arkham games, which are great. And like Suicide Squad seems like it's going to be more fun and have some humor to it, which I can't be upset about, especially because like I don't know if y'all have been watching Peacemaker, but it's a good show. And like the Suicide Squad movie that we got last year was really good. And so if they're continuing in that kind of a direction, sorry, Vertical Slice is my favorite DC character. It's extremely good. Yeah, no. Um, but yeah, if they're continuing in the direction of that kind of like very, very irreverent humor, like I wouldn't mind that so much. I'm worried that in trying to do humor with superheroes, like they might instead end up in the territory of like quippy Marvel humor, which is like extremely tired. But I do think that there is like something slightly fresh to the humor that was in the most recent Suicide Squad and that is in Peacemaker. It at least like is not afraid to be kind of, either incredibly over the top or like disgusting in some cases. So we'll see how this game turns out. But I mean, I'm glad they're at least taking the time to make it. Rocksteady knows what they're doing. So We'll see it when we see it. Let's see. Oh yeah. Oh man, it was an absolutely terrible week for NFTs, which I can't complain about. I can't complain about it being a bad week for them. I can complain about NFTs for hours. Um, but yeah, so let's see. In the same week, we have had EA being suddenly like not opposed to NFTs, but being like, maybe not after all. Let's see, asked about NFTs, aka climate destroying links to JPEGs. During yesterday's investor call, the CEO of EA, Andrew Wilson, gave a long and winding response that ended in a simple answer. Right now, it's not something we're driving hard on, he said, likening it to past venture capitalist fads around 3D, alternate reality, and virtual reality. Which is something of a turn, especially considering the way that the winds are blowing for a lot of other AAA companies like Square Enix and Ubisoft. And yeah, they previously have been like, and then even EA. Wilson previously said anything that brings more people in and engages those people for more time in a context with the extent that I think. Sorry, this is a confusingly worded quote, but anyway, I think it's a good thing over time. Is basically what he said. But yeah, I think he is pretty clearly seeing a different tune, probably based on public reception to many other companies trying them and getting yelled out of the room. Wow, WaPo's over here. The official WaPo account is gaslighting me right now. Yes, I definitely love NFTs. I mean, like, they start with N, so like, why wouldn't I? Oh, am I going to talk about Addison Rae? You better believe it. But not yet. We'll get to that. In any case, yeah. So EA this week already like is acting more hesitant on the subject of NFTs. Then we had the whole saga where Team 17, the creator of the Worms series, beloved in some circles, though if you are, I'm going to go ahead and say if you are under the age of like, let's see, if you're under the age of 28, Worms probably means nothing to you and you've never played it and you've never cared about it. Like maybe I'm wrong. Is there anybody under that age in here who has like played a Worms game? I'm guessing not, but anyway, the creator of that series, Team 17, announced a plan for NFTs around its characters, and then all of its developers, because they're a publisher too, just immediately were like, nah, heck nah. So like, yeah, AgroCrab had worked with them previously. They published a note saying that we condemn them. Platonic, who made Ukulele, also said we have no interest in NFTs and this is terrible. And so did the creators of Overcooked. And so within 24 hours, Team 17 said, okay, maybe actually we're not going to do that after all. Which is, again, just like a dizzying event to have occur in that amount of time. Yes, I also, wow. Yes, I also definitely love the metaverse. Wow, Washington Post gaming, just like knowing me inside and out. But yeah, so then on top of all of that, we had Troy Baker, who is the voice actor that you would actually you've heard him in a million different games. I think maybe most famously right now Joel from The Last of Us, but he is really and truly everywhere. Previously, he had thrown in with a very strange venture, basically Voice First NFT. They're a company that they're making NFTs, but also like they want to work on software that allows you to like recreate a voice actor's voice and then use it in like games or other media properties. So it would be something that would effectively, if not like, it's that sort of thing where like a robot will take your job and that job is voice acting. And Troy Baker decided to throw in with like a company that would theoretically create technology that would make his job obsolete. Um, anyway, people really didn't like that on a lot of levels and got mad at him. That all happened a few weeks ago. He has now decided to not work with that company after all. He said, "Thank you all for your feedback and patience. After careful consideration, I have decided to not continue the partnership with VoiceVerse NFT. Intentions aside, I've heard you and apologize for accusing anyone of hating just by simply disagreeing with me." He did, in fact, get a lot of blowback, but also he is a major public figure and, someone who carries a lot of sway in the industry. So I think that the blowback was to some extent warranted. To what extent people in his personal life went overboard, I do not know. But yeah, so now he's also out of doing that whole thing. Let's see. So somebody requested the Addison Rae story, so I guess I got to jump into that now because it is really I don't want to say shocking. Oh wait, let's see. I doubt that. Achievement Hunter played Worms for a bit, and I'm pretty sure the Zoomers love watching that content. Okay, yeah, I hadn't considered that influencers are wrapping back around to older games like that. So, venture is a nice way to say probably a rug pull scam. Yeah, true. Yeah, especially given the number of prominent rug pull scams we've seen even this week. Which actually, okay, before I get to Addison Rae, this is a perfect crossover. Let me jump to it really quickly because, yeah, speaking of rug pull scams, we had a pretty well known influencer. It's hard to describe what Ice Poseidon is. He's been around for a while now. He used to be like Twitch's edgiest streamer until he got banned after a series of incidents because he basically would encourage his followers to physically come to his location and like mess with him. And that's how he created content. And that went too far. He got swatted on a plane one time. And then, yeah, Twitch just permabanned him. So he's on YouTube now. In any case, he decided to basically take 500,000 from fans to fund his crypto scheme, his own crypto coin. CX coin is what it was called. It's a reference to like his what his group on Twitch used to be called. They were like the CX gang or whatever. Anyway, he got his followers to invest to the tune of $500,000, pocketed $300,000, and allegedly bought a Tesla, and then abandoned CX Coin. So this is bonkers because not only did he do all of that, but I mean, yeah. Oh no, this guy. Yeah, I agree. But yeah, not only did he do all of that, but he got caught and confronted by a YouTuber who specializes in kind of like unfolding scheme or uh, discovering schemes and scams and things like that and exposing them. And then said to that YouTuber that he's not going to return the money. He said that he is, and like I think that this honestly fits pretty well with like Ice Poseidon's whole persona because his whole thing has always been being pretty shameless. It's why he was able to continue having a career after getting booted off of Twitch. He was just like, well, whatever. Anyway, you follow me because I'm this person. It's one of the messed up ways that content creators can continue to exist even after doing massively sketchy things, is just make it their brand. But yeah, so he said he's looking out for himself and he blamed everyone else for putting too much emotion into it, which is a bizarre way to phrase putting hundreds of thousands of dollars into it. I think that there is meaningful difference between emotion and vast sums of money, but whatever. For the record, CX Coin is worth, yeah, it's worth nothing right now. Like, so people invested in, yeah, a rug pool basically. And like, he is just out here owning it and like also blaming people for going along with it, which is just again, just a totally bonkers way to handle this. He said part of the responsibility is on fans as well for putting too much emotion into it. Nobody deserves to get ripped off. Okay. Sometimes you have to look out for yourself. There's just like so much in that, right? Like just totally pushing away any notion of responsibility or blame or whatever. Never mind it that like sometimes you have to look out for yourself also means that you have to be responsible for yourself, but not when you're the person who took hundreds of thousands of dollars from your fans. And so then the coda to the saga is that he did eventually agree to give $155,000 back. But the YouTuber who did all this found that Ice Poseidon had only returned 47,000. So he still pocketed more than he gave back. Just like, come on. Come on. And yeah, as Kotaku points out at the end of this, this is not the first time that we've had kind of video game adjacent influencers caught up in a crypto scam. Last year, members of FaZe Clan were also caught and reprimanded for their involvement in Save the Kids crypto, which was another essentially rug pull. And so yeah, it's just this thing where like, and if we really want to go into it, today an esports team announced that they're going to be getting involved with crypto. I think they're going to do NFTs. Let's see, where's my tab about that? Yeah, let's see. Blockchain.com, that's right, is partnering with Cloud9. So they like it's this thing where clearly crypto folks up to and including people who obviously are willing to engage in scams see a lot of opportunity in influencers because influencers are very good at convincing their audiences like, hey, this is a neat thing that I like, so you should also get involved in it, because there's so much trust built up between influencers and their audiences simply by virtue of like, I think, for one, charisma, obviously, but for two, just sheer persistence. If an influencer is in somebody's life day in and day out over time and like says a lot of things that people broadly agree with and like they're an entertaining presence, then it becomes very easy to say like, oh, well, you know, they've been trustworthy all this time, so I'm going to go in on whatever thing they like or think is cool. So basically, long and short of it is, I think we're going to see a lot more of this. This is definitely not the end of this sort of thing happening, unfortunately. Speaking of kind of influencers leveraging trust that their audiences have in them to sell products that are fully, highly, incredibly bunk, let's just move over to Addison Rae, because that's kind of where things are at this point. So basically, Addison Rae is a very, very popular influencer, um, who, what, she got big on TikTok, right? Yeah, she's a TikTok star. And this week, I think this week, recently, I was trying to do some research on this earlier and didn't come to any conclusions, but very recently announced a line of products that protect people's skin from blue light. Blue light is basically a frequency of light that is emitted by things like computer screens and also by, and you may have heard of this one, the sun. Um, so this is interesting in that you may see this headline here that Valkyrae is shocked about it. Valkyrae is a massive video game YouTuber influencer. She's one of the biggest streamers on all of YouTube. And she's shocked by this because she launched a similar product last year to massive blowback from basically everyone ever, because the thing about all of this is that blue light doesn't cause damage to your skin. It just like, I mean, this is still an under researched area, broadly speaking, but all of the science right now suggests that like the way that you receive skin damage involving blue light is from the sun, which emits all sorts of different light. And so like isolating, saying that it's the cause is ridiculous. And then for two, that your computer screen does not emit enough of anything to cause notable skin damage. You in the course of, I wrote a piece about the entire thing surrounding Valkyrae, and I talked to a lot of experts about this, and their basic conclusion was that like, yeah, you receive more skin damage from light that includes blue light, like the sun, in, you know, spending like a minute walking to your car than you do from like a week at your computer screen, or even more than that. Sorry, one moment. I'm very thirsty. There we go. But anyway, yeah. So like the downsides of blue light are, you know, not super well understood yet, but they also seem to be not really existent. Like, okay, so it's yeah, it's emitted by the sun and can cause skin and eye damage over time. While some experts have suggested the blue light from screens might contribute to eye strain, even that's still an area of contentious debate. The notion that blue light might cause skin damage has even less scientific backing. But the thing is, when there's something that can be perceived as a medical problem that is not well understood, that is where grifters thrive, right? That was I ended up talking to one of the hosts of a very good podcast called Maintenance Phase that is about basically like it puts wellness scams under the microscope. Super interesting, super good. The hosts are amazing. It's a wonderful show. You should check out if you've never watched it. But I talked to one of the hosts of that show, Michael Hobbs, um, and he said basically like, yeah, new technologies often produce minor moral panics about health, like radiation from cell towers, microwaves cause cancer, all these things that were debunked later on. And it's easy for companies to capitalize on those by selling quote unquote cures. Skincare is especially susceptible to wellness grifts because aging happens no matter what. So it's very easy to make the case that something's causing it, even though in fact it's just a natural process. And yeah, it's the same reason multivitamins are scammy. How can you tell if they're working? Or conversely, how can you tell if they're not working? It's very easy to get people in on all of these things. I mean, let's see. I mean, this is the natural progression of having a society that enables influencers. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, right? Because like I cover influencers a lot in my work, and I don't think that they are necessarily a bad thing broadly. I don't think they're intrinsically a bad thing, but I think that under, let's see how to put this, under capitalism as it exists now, it's very easy for them to turn into a negative force if they themselves are not hyper vigilant and hyper responsible. And also just in that, they like they are both they are both causes of these problems and also victims of them, right? So for example, like these influencers, especially streamers, because they have to spend so much time streaming and working and never stopping. Like, I mean, working in some cases like 12 to 14-hour days all the time in order to stay on top of these platforms. They do not always necessarily have time to do the needed research to understand the things that they might be hawking. So they are very easy to rope into schemes like this. And all of that as a result of the way that these platforms are structured to take advantage of the fact that, of course, these people will want to stay on top of their respective platforms. Um, and like in a lot of ways, like Twitch, for example, is highly gamified in this respect. And also relies on, like, if you have the most viewers, you're very visible. If you don't, you are nobody. And so, like, yeah, it's one of those things where you can blame individuals to a certain degree, and indeed you should, and you should hold them accountable. But also, they are trapped inside of much larger, more exploitative systems that they are both benefiting from and being victimized by, if that makes any sense. Um, so yeah. Anyway, Valkyrie did this earlier, or did this last year. Got a huge amount of criticism for it. Eventually, um, basically disowned the product that she had worked on, Reflect, which was a very similar line of skincare products to protect from blue light, and then sort of like took a little time off from streaming. But yeah, to what people are saying in chat, regained public trust relatively quickly. And I think that's kind of the thing about like being an influencer in general, is that, again, for better or worse, like making these massive public mistakes doesn't mean that you are like done for. Like, you, much with traditional fame, you reach a certain level of it and you can't be quote unquote canceled. Like, you just can't, because you just have this critical mass of viewership and of like pre-existing success that means you will continue to be successful no matter what, as long as you just go back to doing the things that made you successful in the first place. And then over time, you'll gain new fans who don't even know about that thing that happened before, and like just life will go on. And I think part of it is that, like, you know, people aren't coming to influencers for good information. They're coming to them for entertainment first and foremost. And then they're getting a side of information in general, because these influencers command so much of their time that after a while, it's just where they get information because they don't have time to seek it out elsewhere. But when, like, kind of faced with this question of like, what is the main value I derive from this person? Like, oh, well, it's entertainment. I'm like, yeah, they messed up, but whatever. I mean, this reminds me of the fact that, like, for example, I don't know if any of you followed it, but there was the whole saga of, let's see, I think it was in 2017 when a bunch of Counter-Strike content creators got busted for like doing quote unquote like skin gambling. So like running these casinos that you could bet Counter-Strike skins on and like hopefully win, other skins and other in-game content, basically. And so it came out that some of these were like entirely rigged, or that content creators were involved in the creation of them, that they registered these businesses and then pretended that they were just like people who were having fun at these online casinos and they had no involvement with them. They're like, oh my God, look at how much I won at this place. You guys should go here and sign up. And then later it was like, oh, well, of course you would say that, you're running it. This is your business. Um, and so anyway, point being, those influencers are still around, still making a killing on YouTube. Like the main ones that got busted, that caused the entire like downfall of Counter-Strike skin gambling as it existed at the time, are like, they're still around, and yeah, are still trusted. Um, so that just tends to be the way that it goes, which is not great. And I even wrote, because I actually wrote a second piece about the Valkyrie saga at the time, and the basic crux of it was that like online drama does not actually produce accountability. Like, I'll pull that up really fast just because I think the point is still salient. Valkyrie, let's see. Trauma Washington Post. Sure, that probably works. Yeah. Because like I think this is true. I think that it was this sort of situation in Valkyrie's case. Like it was this interesting thing where, oh yeah, remember when Logan Paul literally filmed a dead guy and is still one of the most popular influencers in the world? Yep, sure do. Can't really ignore it. Can't miss it. But yeah, like it was this big situation, right, where a ton of people dogpiled on Valkyrie, who, you know, all at once had made a major public mistake and had paired with a company that absolutely wanted to, you know, run a grift. And then also, Valkyrie remained both all at once a public figure and an individual who was suddenly drowning in a lot of cases, I think, probably like abuse that took on a sexualized nature because she's a woman on the internet. And so, like, it was probably on some level, like, very difficult and maybe even somewhat traumatizing. Like, after a certain point, it didn't really make sense to continue going after her. She got the point. Um, and so, like, it became this sort of thing of like, people felt like in behaving that way toward her, they were doing something that was making a powerful figure change their mind or whatever. Um, but after a certain point, all it's doing, all it is abuse. But at the same time, we live in a world now where, like, especially on platforms like Twitter, this feels like the only way we can have agency is you see somebody make a mistake and you jump on them, and like you feel like you individually are contributing to a mass effort to change their mind, or to even, you know, in some ways, like with when it comes to like major brands or organizations or companies or even governments, like change the world. um but in truth, like, you know, it only does so much. And in a lot of cases, it just ends up being the drama of the week. And then somebody like Valkyrie, just no matter what, turns around and regains public trust in a few weeks later. And there's some other big new drama of the week. And so, like, again, it's yet another, yet another way that these platforms kind of like exploit people and our attention and our like inherent drive to, you know, improve things and make things better and hold people accountable and ensure that those around us are trustworthy. But in reality, like, we're not really doing that much that actually matters. It's just taking our energy, which kind of blows. But anyway, I guess Valkyrie is on the side of blue light stuff is bad now. um or at least she is. Yeah, what did she say? I was shocked. I kind of want to message her and be like, listen, hey girl, raid hooray, man, if you want to vent to me, you know, is there something you want to talk about? It, I just can't believe this happened. I can't believe it. Yeah. So, I mean, it seems like, if nothing else, Valkyrie is down to own that she made a mistake and that she wants somebody else to not make the same mistake. So maybe that's good. Maybe in the grand scheme of things, this means that blue light products are being taken less seriously and that an influencer who once threw in with them is now willing to convince other influencers to not. But, you know, maybe it's also just a public gesture to make people like her more, and she's not actually going to do anything. Because kind of either one of those at this point works, and arguably for an influencer would achieve the same effect. So it goes. Let's see. I spent a lot of time on that one. I was going to touch on some other influencer stuff this week, but it's less important. I mean, I can do it really fast. I can speed run it. Let's see. Pokimane announced that her Twitch contract is up a few days ago. And so the question then becomes, okay, is she going to like switch to another platform like so many other streamers? Is she not? Um, I would be shocked if Twitch let her walk, but I've also talked to some people behind the scenes who think they might. But at the same time, a lot of streamers recently have done things like this where they've pretended like, oh man, I'm leaving Twitch, and like have been really on the nose about it. And then they like do a tongue-in-cheek video where they're like, never mind, JK, I'm just staying. That's what like Nick Merckx did. That's what Disguised Toast did. So like, you know, I think Pokimane probably sticks around on Twitch. You know, we'll see. Maybe I'm like horrendously wrong, and everyone's going to come back in a week, a week, a week, and say, "Haha, you were so stupid and wrong. You're a great big dummy." But I think I'm betting on her staying on Twitch. XQC, who, you know, is obviously very controversial, but is nonetheless the biggest streamer on Twitch, is on Twitch for another 2 years. I mean, like, again, much like with Pokimane, there's no way that Twitch lets him walk. He's too big of a name. He's one of the faces of the platform, for better or worse. So they want to hold on to him, even as YouTube builds out its feature set and becomes a more viable platform. Apparently, they're about to add their equivalent to gifted subs, which is good for community building. So, I mean, and they've been promising that anyway. All of that said, definitely Twitch is still the biggest streaming platform far and away. You'll note a slight dip here over time. I think that's partially because like the time frame here is 2021, and so like people were sort of emerging from the pandemic a little bit because we were just dealing with Delta and everyone was vaccinated, so they were watching Twitch less and just kind of watching streaming in general a little bit less over the course of the latter portion of last year. But I mean the proportions still remain more or less the same. You have, in terms of hours watched, 5.8 billion in the third quarter of 2021 for Twitch, 5.7 billion in the fourth quarter, compared to just 1.1 and 1.3, and then 1.2 and 1.2 for YouTube and Facebook, respectively. So, even with all of these big plays that YouTube is making, the overall landscape of streaming is not really changed majorly. Let's see. I didn't get a chance to tap into the Poke news. Why would she even make that announcement without saying where she's going? Yeah, I mean, that's kind of the thing, right? Like, for streamers, like, especially, and I think content creators in general, everything you do has to be an attempt to like stay in the public eye and stay relevant. And so right now she's created suspense. And I mean, there's no storyline, there's no style of story on the internet that will keep eyes on you better than suspense. People want to know where she's going. Now she can like start up a stream somewhere on February 8th and just bring in tons of viewers. Like, that's kind of what it is. Why did I think YouTube streaming was competitive with Twitch? Yeah, it's interesting, right? I mean, it's a perception thing. So like, I think that YouTube has done a really good job of taking control of the narrative, if not necessarily the actual material reality of these platforms. In that they have managed to lure over a bunch of major streamers with like very good deals, both in terms of payout and in terms of the requirement of hours that they have to stream. Because like streaming on Twitch is a very demanding job, as has become apparent through tons of coverage recently. Suspense. But yeah, no. So what YouTube did is basically said like, okay, we're going to get Tim the Tatman, Dr. Lupo, Ludwig. We're going to do it by saying you can come over here and you only have to stream half the number of hours you do per month on Twitch. And you can also make other kinds of content. So you can be a little bit more creative. You don't just have to be like, I'm going to sit in front of a camera all day and kind of like just, try to be on for this whole time, which by the way is, I don't know, for those of you who haven't tried it, it's immensely difficult. I do this like 2 hours once per week and I am so tired already. Like it's exhausting. So imagine doing that for like 12 hours a day, almost every day. And it's just like, I don't know how any of them do it and how they aren't just like massively burnt out. But yeah, so anyway, YouTube managed to like command the narrative really well, better than Facebook, even though Facebook is, look at this, gaining ground on them. At the start of last year, 1.1 to 1.4, 1.3 to 1.2, 1.1, like Facebook surpassed them for a minute in quarter three, and then was neck and neck in quarter four. Like Facebook is arguably has more momentum on streaming than YouTube does. But YouTube has managed to be like, we're the main Twitch competitor. So I mean, that just goes to show like how much, again, it all comes down to branding and like the look of things involving influencers. So that's why you had that misconception, even though it's not entirely aligned with reality. But okay. So anyway, that's all the influencer stuff for right now. Other things. We ran a story that I think that is obviously quite timely and is worth digging into really quickly this week, which is about kind of like the state of things for Black game developers right now. And the thesis is grim. Basically, the push for diversity is a lot of talk and very little progress. And I think this is especially relevant given everything that happened in 2020 with all of the George Floyd protests and everything, and all of these companies vowing to do better on the front of diversity, saying we're going to hire so many more Black creators, Black game developers, Black employees. We're going to make sure that we actually do our part to make the world a better place after we've seen, just how bad it is, just how bad it can be. And then, in spite of all of that talk, which got them oodles of positive PR, the actual result has been pretty much just more of the same. Yeah. Again, gamers, industry veterans, and indie developers of color have continually called for sustainable solutions to address disparities in the field, this push cresting whenever the exhausting cycle renews. Tragedy strikes, A sudden surge of promises and commitments follow. Little to no progress ensues. Then silence falls once more. And yep, that's just kind of how it continues to go. Yeah, I mean, silver lining substantially strengthened the bond between colleagues. But like materially, the problem remains the same. And yeah, as this piece points out, there's also the issue of like Twitch hate raids and how bad that was for streamers and content creators of color. Like there are all these things where again, companies make all of these promises and talk about how diverse they are or intend to be, but then they don't really do anything that makes that promise come true. They just sort of, you know, make gestures. Yeah, let's see. Oh yeah, there's also a I'm pleased to see Evan Narcisse. He's a former coworker of mine in this piece, an incredibly smart dude. Let's see. Recalled how during a recording session for a project focusing on characters from marginalized communities, he said voice actors got choked up as their characters were engaging in dialogue about their lived experiences as people of color. That's the result. Writers like Narcisse want that the words land and a deeper sense of humanity comes through. However, shouldering the responsibility for that kind of engagement is hard work when you're one of the few writers of color in the room. I get on as a consultant for most of my video game projects, which means I don't have hiring power and I'm not in a position of creative control. I can make other people aware of what it's like to experience things from my perspective, but I'm not in that room in a permanent way. So yeah, I mean that's sort of how that's how the games industry works in this regard, right? Is that the status quo is still very white. And like you can bring in people of color all you want, but if you don't make them fixtures, if they are not as equally present as white people, then like the status quo remains. That's just always how it kind of goes. But yeah, it's a well worth reading story. Y'all should check it out. And you know, again, just as a kind of broader pro tip, don't just pay attention to Black people in Black History Month. They actually exist the whole time. They don't just disappear. Let's see. Other things that happened this week that are worth talking about. By the way, winding down now. This has been a long stream. I appreciate everybody who stuck around. Oh yeah. Oh, okay. The fun things, the non-video game things. I mean, I can quickly. Bruno Mars is going to be in Fortnite. That's fun. I mean, I don't know. Silk Sonic is good. That one very popular song of theirs is a bop. So, you know, it continues to be weird to see real people appear in Fortnite, but here they are. It's happening. But more importantly, more pertinently to my interests at this present moment, experts are warning of a quantum apocalypse. Now, this isn't quite as bad as it sounds, but it still does sound pretty bad. The basic idea here, apparently, is that we are on the cusp of a revolution in computing, specifically quantum computing, which will vastly increase the capability, the raw computing power of computers. Meaning, and this is where the apocalypse part comes in, that our current modes of encryption will no longer be useful. Because right now, computers cannot brute force their way through encryption. They can't just like try every possible combination of, you know, numbers or what have you to crack whatever kind of encryption you're using. But if you make computers orders of magnitude better in a way that we can't even conceive of right now, then they can crack anything. And so suddenly the idea of encryption becomes irrelevant because you can just run right through it in a heartbeat. And so then suddenly all of our forms of internet security at the moment just go out the window and anyone can break through anything. And so like basically what will need to happen is a total reformulation of like how computers and the internet and online life work. And I guess the kind of current timescale for that in terms of what people are anticipating is like 10 years, at least before, you know, quantum computing kind of makes it into the public. But you know, we'll see. I do find this last sentence in this piece funny, and by funny I mean like very grim, because sounds like a quantum leap in computing. Wow, yeah. But anyway, this last sentence is great because it's big tech companies and governments are already working to find quantum-proof solutions for storing sensitive data. But it's like the part that I found funny is just like this idea of like, don't worry though, we have time to prepare, and it's like, man, company like we currently live in like a world and a society where like we knew that as a result of what was happening in China in 2019, like a major pandemic was coming our way, and we did like nothing to prepare or change infrastructure meaningfully. And so it's like I appreciate the optimism that companies and governments will in some way like try to safeguard against these things or try to like guard regular people against them, but I am super not convinced even a little bit, because you know, that doesn't really seem to be the way that anything works right now. But it's fun to read people being like, well, you know, it'll probably be fine. um let's see. And then what's this last thing of mine that I pulled open? I've already forgotten. Oh yeah, to close out today's stream, I think we should just watch some guys getting kicked, because as much as Dying Light seems like it's kind of a mediocre game, maybe, like, this is what I want out of video games, for better or worse. I really just want to kick people off of buildings and you know, other structures. And this game seems to have so much of that, to the point where like literally you know, until I saw this video like yesterday, I was like, I'm not going to play Dying Light 2. Like I just don't really care to play another big like map game with a bunch of icons everywhere right now. I'm just not feeling it. And then I saw this and I was like, well, now I have to. Now suddenly I am very interested in spending 500 hours with this game, if only to run at people and drop kick them and watch them fall hilarious distances. So I hope that this video has uplifted everybody's spirits as much as it uplifted mine. And yeah, that's pretty much it for me this week. I have been and hope to remain, at least until I get tired of it, Nathan Grayson. And you've been watching WaPo Story Mode. We do this every week at 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on Thursdays. You know, different subjects each week, obviously, but same basic idea. You know what? I was going to turn on the volume of the men grunting and falling off buildings in the background, but I actually enjoy it, so I'm going to leave it here. But yeah, so we do this every week. We'll be back next week with a different subject, same time. We also do a gameplay stream every Friday. Usually that's at 4 p.m. Eastern as well. Tomorrow it's going to be at 1 p.m. Eastern. I will actually be on that as well. We're going to be streaming Halo with former UFC flyweight champion Demetrius Mighty Mouse Johnson, who's also a big-time gamer. His plan has always been to transition into Twitch streaming full-time after he's done being a fighter. So yeah, we're going to have him on. That should be really fun. If any of you want to tune in for that, you know, obviously feel free. But I mean, otherwise, if you're here for the news, which, you know, it's the Washington Post, so I assume you probably are, we'll be back next week. Until then, thank you everybody who stuck around for the full duration of this thing, and I hope to see you again. Bye.